Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Again, our guest today is John Deuce. He is the Chief Learning Officer of the United Schools Network, or USN, where he directs the network's Continual Improvement Fellowship and serves as an improvement advisor. So he draws heavily on the work of W. Edwards Deming. So hence my stumble over continual when I typically say continuous, but we're not here to debate that. Before I tell you more about John, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Really appreciate you having me, Mark, and looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to talk about here today, talking about improvement science and applications, not just in education, but I think there's going to be a lot that comes out of the topics today that would be applicable to people in any setting. So whether you're listening as an interested parent or somebody else, or just somebody who's interested in improvement, we have a lot to talk about today. So under John's leadership, USN schools have regularly been among the state and the nation's highest performing urban schools. This is in Ohio. So in 2013, John was recognized as the Ohio School Leader of the Year by the Ohio Alliance for Public Charter Schools. So John graduated with honors from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. That's my sister's alma mater as well. He holds a Master of Education degree from the University of Cincinnati. I don't know why I'm mentioning all of this. My nephew is currently a student there, and he's an alumnus of Teach for America. And John is currently continuing his education through the Improvement Advisor Program at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in Boston, Massachusetts. So that's an interesting point we'll come back to later, like learning methods that came from other industries into healthcare, into education. So I'll stop stumbling over different words and phrases here and ask you, John, can you first off give us a little bit of context about a network of charter schools and what that means? Give us the context of the organization that you're in.
Sure. We're a network of 5 organizations, but we really think of ourselves as a small school district here in Columbus, Ohio. So we have 2 middle schools that serve grades 6 through 8 and 2 elementary schools serving grades K through 5. And then I work at our sort of the hub of the network, the home office of the school district that supports the schools. And, really we've grown pretty organically from a single school in 2008 to now a 4-school network serving about 1,000 students here in Columbus, and about 125 staff members between those 5 organizations. And, we're always looking for ways to better serve, our students and families and our staff. And, we've taken various approaches to that, over the last dozen years or so, but I've really latched on to sort of the improvement science methodology and then the continual improvement work, especially the Deming philosophy in the last couple of years. And that's beginning to have a profound impact on the work we're doing here in Columbus.
And one thing I want to point listeners to, John has published a really good ebook that takes a deeper dive into this. The title, I know I have it here in my notes somewhere. I'm not having a good day today. The title of the ebook is?
It's called Rethinking Improvement. It's an introduction to applying W. Edwards Deming's system of profound knowledge to school transformation.
So from reading that ebook, I have I probably overproduced notes because that's why I couldn't find the title. But that's something that's something we can link to in the show notes, right, John?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. And then for and I don't know a lot about charter schools. For context, I'm just curious to learn, think of the background of where you draw students from, parents making a choice to send their children to a charter school as opposed to their local public school.
Yeah. So the policy environment actually just recently shifted so that charters can exist anywhere in Ohio now, but the vast majority over the last quarter century since they've been in existence here in Ohio have existed in the geographic boundaries of a school district that's struggling. The definition of struggling or academic sort of emergency is the words they've used for most of that history. Has shifted, but basically charter schools in Ohio by and large exist in the 8 large urban cities. And then there are some exceptions in outlying areas. So the vast majority of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch, for example. And that's fairly typical of an Ohio charter school. So nearly 100% of our kids qualify. As we, work to set up our program and think about the students that we're going to serve, and then what's, come to fruition is that the vast majority of our students are also, typically behind academically when they enroll. And so there's a lot of sort of deliberate thought around our program and how we can catch them up, especially by 8th grade, so that we can then send them on to high school where you get a lot less support. And so basically our whole network, which is K to 8, 4 schools, K to 8, is set up with that sort of thinking in mind. We're public schools, so we serve whoever comes to sign up. We do a lot of sort of grassroots recruitment to get the word out about the schools, and that includes calling families, that includes open houses, that includes going door to door to let people know in the surrounding neighborhoods that the schools exist. Now 12 or 13 years in, there's some good word of mouth stuff that happens as well, as we get, siblings that come to our system and neighbors and that kind of thing. From a funding standpoint, we get federal and state money, but we don't get local money, which, varies by district, but, amounts to about 40% that then we're looking to sort of make up through philanthropy and grant writing and things of that nature. So, it's we also don't really have access to buildings. So we struggle on that front too. That's something that we're, always fighting for, is where are our schools going to be located, in addition to the resource constraints of the funding system.
Yeah.
And then we basically have had to operate on a very lean sort of budget and staffing model through most of our history. And so I think that's, in some ways that is unfortunate. In other ways, it really makes you thoughtful about what you do with those resources and who's on your team and how you improve those things over time. So.
Yeah. On the positive side, there's some pressure to improve, to better serve the students, but then also to help, I guess, from a competitive standpoint, draw in others. And, you use the word system. You can talk about a school system, a network, a district. So that word system is one, of course, that we talk about a lot in the context of Deming and lean and other approaches, trying to be better systems thinkers, which to me means system design, and then the continual improvement of said systems. So before taking, I think what will be a real good deep dive into the continual improvement side, what are there other elements of the design or the structure of the system that's to the advantage of students in the United Schools Network?
That's an interesting question. When I, first sort of came across Deming's work, a lot of it initially was hard for me to understand, but then some of it, right off the bat resonated. And so even though I didn't have the terminology appreciation for a system or something like that, I think in some ways that's the way I thought before. And so, for example, very early on, we recognized the importance of writing down our processes, our procedures and key areas, be it sort of the operations of the school or classroom, and how we do sort of classroom management, and how we do curriculum and instruction and assessment. So we had manuals in all these areas, how we onboard and sort of train up our people. And so we wrote those things down, define key terms. And I came to learn sort of operational definitions are sort of a key component of Deming's philosophy. Right. And then we continuously improved those every year based on what we had learned. And so while I wasn't using sort of continuous improvement language and I didn't know Deming, we were doing some things that would sort of fall in that camp. And I think that was to the benefit of students for sure.
Yeah, I'm paraphrasing, but there's certainly a Dr. Deming idea of if you can't write it down, you don't have a system or processes. And similar idea that comes from Toyota or Lean or other influences around what you might call standardized work. If you can't write it down and define things as a process, it's not a repeatable process, which then we would, in most cases, suggest would lead to better outcomes. The more better defined that process is, even as a baseline for continual improvement.
Yeah, no, that's 100%. That standard work is probably the right word for, what's captured in those manuals. And then, what you just said about the sort of paraphrase Deming quote, this idea of, without an aim, there is no system. I think, I didn't have that language, but, we've always had a strong mission and vision statement and made sure that people that were considering working here or volunteering here or supporting in some other way, they knew what that vision and mission were. And I think that that's helped us. While we didn't have that aim system terminology, we were pointing in that direction. That's been super helpful. And now that we've discovered that sort of idea, we've been even more deliberate about, okay, what's our aim for eighth grade, or, what's our aim for our high school placement program? What's the aim of the organization as a whole? Because that changes over time. And then making sure, now that we have more people, we started as 6 staff in the basement of a church with 57 students. And now we have 130 staff and 1,000 students and many more supporters. So how do we make sure that everybody is, moving in the same direction, so that aim work has become even more important as the network has grown?
Yeah, so it's important, of course, starting with that aim. And in the ebook, there's a very Deming-like diagram of a system of inputs and outputs and steps in an education process. And in that, you make reference and point to voice of the customer as input to what that aim or what the objectives of the system would be. I imagine this is complicated, maybe even more complicated than healthcare. How do you define customer for education between students, parents, the communities, future employers, future education institutions, all of the above? Yes, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all of those things. Certainly, families and students are sort of on the front end in terms of input, and then sort of on the output side, they sort of show up in that flow diagram as well. I mean, I think it's for us, because we're a K-8 system, so I would throw high schools in there. Making sure that we're preparing students for that sort of that very next stage in the process. Higher education, even the arts and the military and the community as a whole, I think are all sort of customers in different ways, and provide feedback in different ways. But I think they're all important parts of the system. And when you sort of step back and look at it that way, there's so many areas for improvement beyond, the organizational chart that just sort of shows your staff. So that's kind of how I have started to talk about it with folks here, is that, when you think of your organization, think of that system, that flow chart that you're referring to, and not just the org chart that's, mapping who reports to who and who's accountable to who and that type of thing in terms of the adults.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear your story, or, share it with the listeners here. Where did you first learn about what we could describe as continuous improvement or continual improvement practices and principles and such? It was even before your exposure to Deming, right?
Yeah, I mean, I in that book you referenced, I kind of thought about my own sort of learning across my career. I'm about 20 or so years into my career as an educator, and I sort of divided up into these 4 stages or so. Early on in my career as a teacher, sort of like, I call it like stage 0, where it's just like trial by fire. I'm kind of going day by day, learning how to be a teacher and to run a classroom. And then, as I got into my career, I was lucky enough to be on the startup team of a charter school in Denver, and was exposed to a whole host of resources that I would call sort of like on the technical side. So data-driven instruction and teaching techniques that work in classrooms. I also got to, through some of those experiences, was on the startup teams of about 7 organizations between schools and the nonprofit where I work now. And so I learned a lot on that technical side, but I wasn't really doing anything that I would call sort of continuous improvement by name. And then stage 3 is sort of like, I got a random email about this book that came out called Learning to Improve: How America's Schools Can Get Better at Getting Better. It was written by a team of people led by Tony Bright, who at the time was the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching out in Palo Alto. And it piqued my interest. I picked up the book, read it. I was first introduced to the sort of improvement science. I'd never heard that sort of term coined like that. And started going to the Improvement Summit at the Carnegie Foundation starting in 2016. So that was my first exposure, kicked off my improvement science learning. And I would say it was sort of very focused on tools at the time. And then some of the sort of core principles that Carnegie talked about. But it was very much a lot of self-driven learning. And then I, through some of that study, came across Deming's name, and that sort of opened up this whole other sort of learning journey that sort of where I came to realize the importance of the way of thinking, the theory behind some of the tools. And that's sort of where I'm at now, is really studying that theory and then learning how to use the tools with that theory in the background.
Yeah. So tools and theory, Dr. Deming would use the word theory, talking about the importance of theory, but at the same time, having some practical methods. I mean, before we talk more about the way of thinking, what were some of the tools that were being presented as being most applicable in an education setting?
Some of the first things I saw through Carnegie were tools like the fishbone diagram, and thinking about sort of mapping out the causal system of the problems that you're seeing within your system. They also are big proponents of the driver diagram, and so and then they would say, this is the visualization of your theory for improvement, and there's a theory of action. And so there was a lot, of terminology to kind of track. But those 2 tools in particular are tools that I use often in the education setting at different stages of our improvement work. I think the driver diagram I really like because it fits on one page, and I can say to people, don't overthink this. We're literally driving towards a better system, driving towards solving this problem, or at least improving it. And here are some of the big levers we're pulling, and then we're breaking those down to the point where we're actually talking about modifications to how the actual work is getting done. So those are 2 that stick out, especially in the early learning that I was doing. I also learned about the 5 whys, and as a part of root cause analysis. So that was a helpful tool as well.
Well, it seems like one big challenge in education is like you can measure outputs in different ways. Test scores, I guess, are still a way of doing that, or the predominant way of doing that. A lot of the inputs maybe are out of the control of the school district. You've got influences of poverty or disruptive home lives and other things that get in the way of kids being able to study or having just a healthy, calm environment. I'm mentioning all my family members today. My mother was a teacher, elementary school teacher in inner city Detroit, where the poverty rates were among the highest in the country. And the challenges, unfortunately, the stresses and the challenges that kids would bring into the classroom didn't put them in a position to be taught to focus. And so is it a matter of trying to just, do the best you can given factors you have direct control over? Or I'm just curious how you think through situations like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I remember a passage in that Learning to Improve book, because Bright has a long history as a researcher. Before he went to Carnegie, I was at the University of Chicago. Did a lot of research on trust in inner city Catholic schools, and then a lot of research in Chicago public schools because they have a research consortium between the University of Chicago and Chicago public schools. And so he basically had this paragraph. It's on page 63. I remember it. It's so, the language he uses is so vivid in my memory. Is basically, sometimes working in schools where there are so many challenges, it's sort of like rolling a rock up a hill, and it can sort of fall back on you at any time. So he says something to the effect of, even schools that are doing pretty well under those conditions are always like on the edge of a cliff, ready to drop off. A key staff member leaves, or this program is no longer available, or whatever, can really, shift things in challenging ways. And so, I've always thought about my work, even before I did the continual improvement stuff, as being on the other side of that rock and not letting it roll down the hill. And we have great people here that help with that. So I'm certainly not alone in trying to hold that rock back. But what we're looking at is deliberate design from start to finish, be it the selection system at the front end or the teacher training as we start to onboard, especially new staff. And then even, intervention systems and other things that we're doing with students to catch them up. I mean, it's all, very deliberately designed and thought through. And then we try to improve those systems, year over year, as we see what works and what doesn't, and as things, change over time.
So there we have it, PDSA cycles.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So this is taking a little bit out of sequence, but before we're going to take a deep dive into Deming, I want to connect dots to healthcare, and I want to hear a little bit about your learning from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. Great organization, very influential. In healthcare, they use similar language around improvement science. But one parallel that I think I'm seeing in healthcare, if you're measuring, let's say, mortality rates at given hospitals, similar to education, some of the inputs of the health or of patients, poverty levels, access to care, could mean that some of these measures are not apples to apples from one hospital to another. If you're trying to measure or gauge quality, there's this phrase they use in healthcare, social determinants of health. And it seems like I don't know if that similar phrase is used, social determinants of education achievement.
Yeah, I've heard the social determinants of health. I think there's an analogy there with education, although I haven't heard people sort of phrase it in that way. But I think, talking about very similar sort of inputs and their impact on the outcomes. So I think the analogy works in a lot of ways between healthcare and education.
Yeah. So then back to IHI, how did you end up learning directly from IHI, considering that the H, of course, stands for healthcare?
Yeah, like a lot of these things, I, did a lot of reading on improvement science and a lot of podcasts, a lot of articles, and just sort of paid attention to who was getting mentioned and organizations that were mentioned. And in Tony Brike's Learning to Improve book, Don Berwick played a pretty prominent role, especially in the early chapters and the introduction. And I think what had happened was Tony Brike gets his appointment at Carnegie and decides that improvement science is going to be the focus for the organization. And there's not a lot of places to go to learn the science of improvement. One of those places that he knew of was the Institute for Healthcare Improvement. So I think early on, he took staff members from Carnegie to IHI for various trainings. And because of that mention, I sort of did some research and saw that they had some really great training at IHI. And the first one I actually signed up for, I think was in 2018, I did their Breakthrough Series college, where they train people how to run healthcare collaboratives. But there was a number of education organizations there in addition to healthcare organizations. And that was of interest to me because for a number of reasons, but one was because the Gates Foundation was beginning to fund this networked improvement community type work, this collaborative type work in the education system. So I want to go learn how they were doing that. And more recently, I've enrolled in their Improvement Advisor program to sort of continue my own learning in improvement science.
Yeah, it's great to be able to connect the dots. I mean, improvement science is very transferable. Dr. Deming's approach and philosophy and methods are very transferable. Process behavior charts, we're going to come back and talk about this later on, very transferable in terms of helping build or support a culture of improvement. But going back then, John, to your initial exposure to Deming, and you wrote about this in the ebook you mentioned earlier. I think you said in the ebook you were a little turned off, or I don't know the exact phrase. You said, it was a little hard to understand, and some of the Deming reading can be a slog. But I'm wondering, how you worked through that, and something changed in kind of your embrace of Dr. Deming's work, if you can talk about that too.
Yeah, I think it was the sort of exposure to IHI, which was founding on Deming's philosophy. Don Berwick was a big proponent of Deming's work. I had
student of his.
I had stumbled across Deming's name in a number of places, but prominently on the IHI website. And so I went to the Deming Institute website, and there's a page that sort of explains his theory. You obviously know it better than me, the system of profound knowledge. But when I first read about it, even the name, I was like, who calls their stuff profound knowledge? What does that mean?
Right.
It was sort of like the name seemed sort of antiquated. And then when I read about it, it was interesting, but it was sort of just like incomprehensible. Mm-hmm. And then there was also this dissonance with a number of the ideas, versus sort of the traditional management techniques that you sort of learn about in the United States. And, so I didn't really do much with that discovery for about 2 years. And then something happened. I think I saw his name again in a book, and I went back to the website, the Deming Institute website, in maybe late winter of 2020. And not that it just fully made sense or clicked, but for some reason I was more open to the ideas. They made a little bit more sense. It lit a fire. And, from about that time, just about 2 years ago, been deep into this study of Deming's work. And then, not only his books, but others that, have written about his ideas. So,
yeah. And Dr. Deming in his books spoke about education very directly in a number of ways. Like I had read Deming, and then I was in business school, and I went back and reread what Dr. Deming had said about MBA programs. Like, okay, I recognize that. His criticisms of MBA programs and some of the things that are taught, as you're kind of pointing to, kind of typical management practices. But even the broader point first, we talk about measurement, whether it's health outcomes or education outcomes. Deming on one hand would talk about the importance of data, but then he would also say the most important things are unknown and unmeasurable. So how do you process that as an educator?
Yeah, a lot of those quotes and, those ideas that show up in his writing were really tough. Those are some of the toughest things for me to wrap my head around. Things like what you just said, that the most important things are, the most important measures are unknown or unknowable. But you can manage them, right? Because there's this quote where they only usually tell half the quote, where it's like, something like, if you can't measure it, then you can't improve it. And Deming would say, no.
Yes.
That's not true.
The full quote is something like, many people say,
right,
if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. The rest of the thought is something along the lines of, and that's complete hogwash.
Yes. Yeah. They always forget that second part. So, even now, well, I think one thing I had to sort of, as I went on this learning journey, beginning in that spring 2020, I started listening to the podcast on the Deming Institute website. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those are interviews, and I would just call up or email the people that were being interviewed. And many of them, almost all of them that I've reached out to, responded right away and said, sure, let's talk. One of those early people was Kelly Allen, who's heavily involved at the Institute. And he said, if you're an educator, then you got to talk to David Langford. And I did. I called him right then and there, and he called me back, and we ended up starting a 4 or 5 month executive coaching relationship where I'd say, okay, Deming says abolish grades, but that seems really radical. You know, what is he talking about here? Or even, very simple things like system profound knowledge. What did he mean by profound knowledge? Because David had direct contact with him and participated in his seminars, and Deming was very interested in David's work as an educator. You know, he worked with him for 7 years. I then was able to sort of ask these same questions to David. And so that clarified a lot for me. And we've maintained, he's a coach in a Continual Improvement Fellowship that I run internally at our organization. And so even on those sessions, as we've gone now over a year with a second cohort, I'm learning every time. I do some of the coaching, but I do a lot of learning, from him and other folks that have been generous with their time. So
yeah. I think I found, within that community of people who are students of Dr. Deming, and I would consider myself as such, through Dr. Deming's books and secondhand through others, like Don Wheeler, who worked with, that was two-way learning, as it turns out, between Dr. Deming and Don Wheeler. It's such a small percentage of the population that even has interest in these topics. Mm-hmm. I mean, if somebody reaches out to me, like I think, you'd reached out to me and said, let's talk about process behavior charts. I'm like, all right, yeah, when, how soon can we? And then even better, more broadly, some of the Deming philosophy. There's a parallel there where, like, if somebody reaches out thinking about lean and somebody, I don't really want to have a conversation about 5S, no offense to 5S as a tool or a method. But if somebody wants to talk about culture and management behaviors and things like that, that's, I think, a more interesting, more impactful conversation. But like some of these other conversations, I had a chance to interview Alfie Kohn in episode 57, who was, I think, influenced heavily by Dr. Deming and is mentioned by Deming in his books. And, Alfie Kohn, talks about, eliminating measures, abolishing grading, talking about the downsides of competition. Like, that's another really radical thing that Deming even wrote about too, because, I think there's this kind of very American ideal that competition makes everybody better. Like, well, in the classroom, though, there's this balance where you need collaboration to help better learning. So I threw a bunch of thoughts at you there. I'm just, I'll ask the lazy question of what are your reactions to any or all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Alfie's book, oh man, it just escaped me. Punished by Rewards was one of those early books. So, as I kind of think about that chain of books, probably the first one I read sort of that would be in the Deming camp or a student of Deming was Understanding Variation by Donald Wheeler. And then The Essential Deming. And then Measures of Success was the next one, because I was really interested in the Understanding Variation stuff. Yeah, I saw that in the background.
I'm going to hold it up. Sorry.
Pretty soon after that was Alfie's book, Punished by Rewards. And, I think I have a memory of hearing about Alfie Kohn's work probably more than a decade ago, probably close to 2 decades ago, but I really didn't dive deep into it. I knew people had strong feelings on either side. But as I've gotten into the Deming stuff, as I've learned or tried to learn the why behind why he was saying what he was about grades or, things like intrinsic motivation, when I applied the theory to my own life, be it my own personal self or my own kids, I couldn't ever find like a crack in the armor. I mean, I'm sort of a natural skeptic. The first thing I don't believe that. Let me look that up, that type of thing. And every time I did that with the Deming stuff, be it like trying to apply some of the things he was saying or think back and reflect on how I've experienced things professionally, I had a really hard time ever finding sort of where there was a flaw. And same thing with Alfie. Alfie Kohn's ideas probably are radical to a lot of people, be it about competition or grades or whatever. But, when I've listened to him speak, there's a recent Monk podcast debate he did on grading. And he just, he's thought about this a lot. And one of the things he said at the end towards his closing statements on grading was, we want students to experience success and failure as information, not as reward and punishment. And then I really started to think, how has this played out in my own life? And what behaviors have I done because of grades or because of a possible award that would come with grades or admittance into some type of, honor society or whatever. And I thought, that's not always that behavior that I've done doesn't always make a lot of sense from like a learning standpoint. And so even when we're talking about these ideas internally, like, abolish grading, and people say, whoa, that's crazy. And, I'm still thinking about that one. I think about this example, for example, and I think it was in the Deming Dimension by Henry Neve, where he tells the story of an engineer from Ford that went to a 4-day seminar and then, saw point number 3 in the 14 points. It says, get rid of inspection basically. And then he goes on Monday and fires all of the inspectors. And it didn't go very well because inspection was a part of the system.
Well, and I think the point says cease reliance on inspection, which is a little bit more nuanced. And yeah, I mean, the ideal, for Lean or the Toyota production system is to build in quality and not rely on inspection. But I'll tell you, a Toyota assembly plant in the year 2022, I haven't been to one in a couple of years, I'll assume it's still the same, has, guess what, a final inspection line. And you think, well, wait a minute, I thought you said build in quality. I'm like, well, the system is still not robust and reliable enough to where the cost of final inspection is lower than the cost of letting defects through to the customer, seems to be the determination.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when people, I think sometimes when we have these discussions internally about some of this philosophical stuff, people get a little nervous. And I always say, well, we're not throwing this out. We're thinking through, what does this mean? What would a replacement system be for this thing that we're thinking about? All of that would be sort of very deliberately thought out before we considered any changes. But it sparks really good conversation. And I think that's where we're at, is we're not necessarily throwing anything out that we're doing, but we're also really deeply thinking about why we do what we do. And I think that's part of the point of Deming's philosophy, is to get you to really think deeply about why you do the things that you do. Yeah.
And just one other point, or connecting dots, Norm Bodek, who was in a way the co-founder of this podcast. It was his idea. He was my first guest. He was famous for bringing Japanese books to the US and translating and publishing and doing a lot around Kaizen and continuous improvement. And one thing Norman would love getting on a soapbox about was the decline in creativity that occurs in school children. And I don't have the studies or, what he said anyway, was you would see a steep decline in creativity starting in the first grade. And you say, well, I don't know, correlation, causation. He said, that's when grading starts. Kids are taught or conditioned to not take risks and do things that might lead to a bad grade. That was a point he would make, not necessarily. Some of that was his own observation, perhaps.
Yeah, and and I mentioned, thinking about my own life. I thought back to a time my senior year in high school. I played football and was injured right as the school year started, and it was an injury that required surgery, and so had pain medicine, and the start of the school year was tougher because of the injury. And I was a good student, but math was always my probably toughest subject, and I was in calculus, and it was really tough at that start because of the surgery and the pain medicine and the having to miss school for physical therapy and stuff like that. And I ended up dropping the class because I was worried that I was going to get a B or God forbid a C. And then, I was sort of in the running for valedictorian or salutatorian. And so that was where the emphasis was, rather than on, the learning of calculus that would be helpful, in college, obviously. So, I think that's an example. I mean, it's not a life-ending decision, but it's maybe a life-changing decision when you sort of put the emphasis on the extrinsic reward versus the learning. And I think if grades weren't a factor, I wouldn't have dropped the class. I just would have, gotten some extra help or something like that. So that's one concrete example.
That's a good,
that comes into play.
That's a good illustration. And random question here. You talk about playing football and your last name is Deuce, it's Dues for the listener, but Deuce, please tell me you wore number 2.
I didn't. 25.
25. Well, it's a 2 and an upside down 2. I don't know.
Yeah.
22 would have worked also.
Yeah. Yep.
So anyway, I do want to talk a little bit about process behavior charts, of course. And the ebook gives a really good example and illustration of data points and, the table of numbers, color-coded numbers, and then a process behavior chart to look at signal versus noise. Assuming hopefully a lot of listeners from other episodes or their own work have understanding of process behavior charts on some level. Can you talk about where you found applications for this in education-related data or metrics?
Oh man, everywhere. I mean, I mentioned Gates. I didn't get those early big grants for collaboratives, but I did get a Gates grant for continuous improvement work. And at the same time, we got a grant from Dell to sort of work on some data infrastructure stuff. And one of the innovations for us, because we're working with a group that does a lot of sort of data design stuff, because we don't have a lot of internal capacity. They're good at dashboards, but we introduced them to the process behavior chart. And so they're really interested now. What is this? What do these red lines mean? And so at the same time, we're introducing this to our network. We're building these pretty cool dashboards that these designer folks are interested in. I would say the first application, because I was sort of learning about this stuff at the same time that the pandemic hit and schools went remote, those two things coincided. And so even before the process behavior chart became useful, this idea of operational definitions was very useful, because we discovered very quickly, even though we're pretty systematic, we have 2 middle schools geographically 5 miles apart, and they do everything very similarly, but they had very different definitions of what it meant to be engaged in a remote environment for a student. And so the very first thing that we did during the school closure was come up with a definition of remote learning engagement. And then because we're pretty data driven, our folks at the school level were already collecting the data and putting it into tables. And then they were also color coding it red, yellow, and green. Right. And then, I was getting exposed, and a couple other people were getting exposed to this understanding variation stuff from Wheeler and the process behavior chart from your book. And, they would do something like color code 62, and I remember this, 62% engagement was red, but 67% was yellow. And I was like, well, what's the difference between 62 and 67? I know one's bigger than the other, but in reality, what's the difference? And so we took it out of the tables for them and started putting it in a process behavior chart and sort of explaining what the ups and downs mean and what to look for to determine if there was significance between 62 and 67%, because there's a chance there could be significance. There wasn't. But it allowed us, especially in a stressful time, new learning systems, remote learning, a lot of trying to figure out what the pandemic meant for education. The process behavior chart literally allowed us to do the subtitle of your book, react less. I forget all of it, but the reacting less part stands out.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're doing that. React less, lead better, improve more.
That's right. Yeah. Instead of overreacting, our, remote learning engagement in 8th grade math went down to, 57% this day, instead of reacting to individual data points, we were looking at the system evolve over time, what it was capable of. And then once we sort of had some of that data baseline, then we could start talking about as a group, how do we improve that? And there, I think we've always been a pretty people focused sort of organization, but there was, the proclivity for, what's wrong with that guy's class? Why is his engagement so low versus what's the system that's producing that engagement, and how can me and the math teacher and a team of people work on that system to improve it over time. It changes the conversation, allows people to see what's happening in their system, what the system is capable of, those types of things.
Yeah. And so there's those points of distinguishing signal from noise that Don Wheeler teaches so well. And I've learned from him on that. And then there's also that lesson, the trouble with arbitrary targets. Why is, if 65% was the threshold between red and yellow, what meaningful difference does that make is a really important point. Or I think you even said in the ebook, let's say if the threshold for green was 80, how often do we see in different organizations where people look at a metric that's green and they say, well, it's green, there's nothing to look out here, look at. And but we should still be working toward closer to 100% engagement, right? So that ends up being a cap on performance.
Yeah, and the 80% example, that means 20%, 1 out of 5 kids aren't engaged on that particular day. That's not good. That's not good. That's not a worthy goal.
Now, that might be typical in the system as currently designed. Yes. Back to the point of looking at signal versus noise. And, this is other comparison that is usually not the first thing taught about process behavior charts, but where you can look at comparisons, a snapshot in time. Mm-hmm. If you were looking across, if you were in a district that had, let's say, 20 schools, or you could do this looking at hospitals within a region of the VA health system and say, okay, well, here are the engagement rates at all these different schools. You randomize the order of the schools. So you put them in alphabetical order. Mm-hmm. Wheeler teaches how you do this. And then you use the same math and the same concept to look and see if any of those schools are a statistical outlier from each other. Yes. Or a signal. Back to your point of, well, that school's at 62% and that school's at 67%. Are we going to fire the leader of the 62% school? That's probably an overreaction.
Right.
If they're both in the range of the control chart, the process behavior chart.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point about comparing the various organizations, and even when the pandemic hit, even informally, school leaders were talking about remote learning engagement. But what I found pretty quickly is that they didn't even have that concept defined in the same way. So they weren't even talking about the same thing. So, one school's 80% engagement, another school's 50% engagement. Like, the comparison between the two were essentially meaningless because the definitions were different. Like I said, even at our own middle schools, initially they had 2 different definitions. One had a pretty rigorous definition of what it meant to be engaged, and one had a less rigorous definition. And you could see, if you didn't dig into that, the less rigorous definition is going to result in higher engagement and perhaps praise to those folks. When in reality, something better is probably going on at this other place that has this more rigorous definition of what it meant for a student to be engaged. And I think things like that are happening all the time in education and other sectors as well.
Well, and I think this performance data, I've always made, for a long time, I've made the same point, that data should be used for learning and improvement as opposed to using it for punishment, as you said earlier about grades or educational measures. So I want to touch on a couple things, maybe real quick, a little bit more rapid fire, things that I thought were really interesting from your ebook. Sure. There's a lot that was in it. It was all interesting. But when you talk about the appreciation for systems thinking, you talked about a study that looked at the impact on individual professional development spending. Can you tell us a little bit about that, at least a summary?
Yeah, I think that research was really interesting, and basically the idea was they had one researcher had sort of earlier on come up with a rigorous definition of what it meant to do professional development for educators, and then looked at when that sort of type of professional development was implemented, what type of effectiveness that it had. And basically what they found was none. And my basic assessment was, look, you're training people maybe in a worthwhile technique, but that thing may have no sort of impact on organizational improvement. That's a completely different set of sort of tools and techniques that you need. And because those two things were disconnected, you're doing one thing and it wasn't showing up in this other camp because you weren't doing the right thing. So that really stood out to me, that it sort of, I think the comparison I used was, if you train a surgeon in a specific technique, is that going to show up in various outcome data for a hospital as an organization? Probably not. It doesn't mean the training itself isn't worthwhile.
Sure.
But if you're expecting it to lead to those outcome results at the organization level, probably not going to happen.
Yeah, I think there's a clear parallel, whether it's in healthcare or manufacturing or what have you. The number of whatever color belts that you're training and certified in the context of Six Sigma or Lean Six Sigma. I've seen that in different organizations where, all of that individual professional development, while not bad, doesn't change some of the core pieces of the system that would, for example, prevent them from using what they learned in that good, valid professional development activity.
Right.
Another thing that I think was really interesting, Peter Schultz, who is amazing. He passed away, I think, over a decade ago. Unfortunately, he was at University of Wisconsin and is well known in quality improvement circles. He pointed out, as you quoted from the Leader's Handbook, there's this old expression. I've heard it come from the training within industry methodology. It probably predates that. If the student, so Schultz said, the adage, if a student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught, is not true or useful. Instead, a much more useful characterization is, if the learner hasn't learned, the system is not yet adequate.
Yeah.
So and maybe he's saying, well, don't blame, quote unquote, the teacher. Mm-hmm. But what are some other reactions to that quote?
Yeah, I think that pretty similar to yours. I mean, I think 10 years ago, I saw some version of, if the student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught, and thought, oh yeah, because I think if you sort of follow an evolution, first it was all the student's fault and then it was the teacher's fault. And in reality, there's this whole system of things that are going into all of those learning processes. And, no one individual is able to sort of overcome the system, no matter how good they are. It's that sort of that similar thinking where you can, have a really great star football player, to go back to that, and you put them in a bad system. Yeah, they almost never overcome that. Right. Versus if you put, even an average player sometimes in a really great system, they sort of outperform how they have before. And it's the same type of thinking, that this blaming any individual is not helpful, which is sort of what a lot of the education accountability systems have done, either blaming individual schools or blaming individual teachers when it comes to, test score data or growth data or whatever, when really there's this system that we have to work on. That's really where the area of focus should be. Yeah.
In your ebook, you get into theory of knowledge, and I think those questions that you pointed out in the ebook. Why do we do the things we do? Some of these things are so ingrained that we don't question them, and that touches on all sorts of things we've talked about today. Why do we color code data in these tables of numbers? Why do we assign numerical or letter grades? Some of these things fall in the category of, well, that's the way we've always done it. So those conversations, as you said, hopefully lead to progress, right?
Yeah. There's I think all kinds of things that fall in that bucket. And I think, I can't remember if I said it in the ebook or the book that I'm writing, basically when you start to sort of think about that list, it can be a little bit daunting, and you almost want to apologize to people for some of the stuff. And then, that's where, some of the Deming stuff becomes really helpful, because he says things like, I make no apologies for learning, not that you're a jerk about it, but, he's on this continual path to improvement as well. And so, if the old way was you did it the best you knew how, and then you learned a new way, there's really no apology to make for that. But you make the change, and you get on that path to improvement.
Well, and I've heard, a story told by Don Wheeler that illustrates Deming's continual learning, that there's a lot that Don Wheeler learned from Dr. Deming, and there's a lot that both came down from Walter Shoehart, the creator of these different forms of control chart. And Don Wheeler says he's the one who really helped Dr. Deming understand the process behavior chart. The quote unquote XMR chart was so applicable to the things Dr. Deming wrote about and taught and talked about, whether it's the red bead game or real world performance measures.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one place I haven't dug into yet is Shoehart's original work. I have one of his original books, but I haven't dug up in there yet. I also have C.I. Lewis's The Mind and the World Order on my nightstand. I'm 50 pages in, and some of that stuff is really hard to unpack, but I'm trying.
So to think back to President Kennedy, we read these things not because they're easy, but because they're important, or because
Right.
they are hard, or paraphrasing. But.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, again, our guest today has been John Deuce. Tell us a little bit more about the book and the aim and the progress there.
Yeah. So, I read a bunch of books when I began this journey. I write a monthly blog post on our website and post it to LinkedIn and really do that to sort of process what I've learned and then put it out there to see what the feedback is. And then took some of those blog posts and put it into this ebook that we've talked about. And then kind of at the same time, once I felt like I had some grasp of the Deming theory, I started writing an actual book. Sort of the working title is Rethinking Improvement, My Deming Journey to Transformation. So there's a first draft done. I'm a first-time author, so I'm working to find a publisher right now. And I'm hoping, to publish it by, fall of 2022 or so. But it unpacks how I've gone about learning this, and then sort of takes the theory and applies it to some of the work I do here at United Schools Network to bring it alive for people, maybe make it a little easier to understand than some of the manufacturing examples or whatever that don't maybe translate as well.
Yeah, that's great.
In doing so, helping us get better as an organization, me learn. So that's really sort of the aim of writing the book.
Writing a book is a great way to better your own understanding of a topic. I felt like that coming into the book Measures of Success.
Yeah,
certainly brought my learning, and there's the learning, and then there's the ability to articulate it clearly and going through those cycles.
Yep.
PDSA cycles of writing.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what's happened. It sharpens your own sort of knowledge of these things, which are not easy to understand. And so I think of something like you had your 10 key lessons for data analysis, and I really had to think about how do I translate that into something that works for education.
Yeah.
And, how many data points do I need in the baseline and under what conditions and things like that. So it really made me sharpen up the language I was using and my references to other people's work. And, it's become a tool that people here can use because it's gone through that sort of iteration process.
Well, that's great. So I'll look forward to seeing that book. That'll be the book's publication will be a great excuse for us to do another episode together. How's that?
Yeah, I would welcome that. I would certainly appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks. So again, our guest today has been John Deuce from the United Schools Network, Columbus, Ohio area. I'll put links in the show notes for the ebook, the blog, John on LinkedIn. Please follow him or connect and check out the great stuff he's sharing. So John, thank you. Thank you so much for being a guest today.
Yeah, Mark, I really appreciate it. Thank you.